I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, not exactly here. I'm here with you virtually in Seville, Spain. Alexander, how are you doing today in London?
In cold, wet, soggy London, but I'm doing extremely well. Listening to you in sunny Spain, in Seville, I believe.
Yes.
And I've got my warm, comforting magic mug next to me to keep me warm. So Duran magic mug. So.
Great, Alexander. I'm walking in a little courtyard at the Plaza de Triunfo in center Seville. And it's very, very far away from what's happening in China and Hong Kong. But this is a story that we've covered in detail on many videos in the past. But we need to revisit what's going on because violence is escalating once again. So Alexander, take us into this story.
Yes, I think what has happened is that we've seen since the start of the protest movement back in July, and we've discussed the origins of this protest movement in previous videos, and we've sought to explain that it really comes down to this very anomalous situation that Hong Kong has, in which it's a sort of self-governing entity within a centralized communist state, which is China, a communist state which, of course, has a market economy and which has achieved enormous economic growth over the last 20 years, and in which Hong Kong has steadily played a less and less important role. I mean, by some estimates, it now accounts for no more than 3% of China's GDP. And what has happened over the course of that time is that the people of Hong Kong, or at least many people in Hong Kong, have begun to sense that Hong Kong's separate identity within this Chinese colossus is starting to erode away. And there's also been concern, both on the part of certain sections of the business oligarchy, if you wish, that rules Hong Kong, and some of its more radical sections of the population, that the Chinese government is trying to increase its control of Hong Kong through various devices, like an extradition law that was being discussed a few months ago, but the idea of which has now been dropped. So what you've seen is growing protests in Hong Kong, which the Chinese government has not intervened against, and which the Hong Kong government, in my opinion, initially was not entirely unhappy to see happen, because from its point of view, those protests could be used by the Hong Kong government to try to persuade Beijing, the Chinese government in Beijing, not to press ahead with ideas like the extradition law and to allow Hong Kong rather more slack within this very strange system of one nation, two systems that Hong Kong functions within. Unfortunately, what has happened, and I did warn about this in earlier programs, is that by allowing the protests to continue in the way that they have, we've created a kind of political limbo situation in which neither the protesters are able to get the full extent of what they want because China cannot concede it. And at the same time, as the protests have continued, they have gradually become more violent, and that violence has been normalized, increasingly normalized, and increasingly legitimized in the eyes of some of the protesters. And I'm afraid that is what tends to happen when governments and authorities allow protests like this to continue unabated and for so long. So over the last few days, we've seen the situation, I think, evolve in Hong Kong into what it is not, I think, inappropriate to refer to as an outright insurrection, a violent insurrection, by some sections of the Hong Kong community, in particular the student community. And the last that we're hearing is that they're now concentrated and have occupied the university premises in Hong Kong. And as I said, the protests have become much more violent. People have died, and there have been some utterly horrifying incidents. For example, one in which a person who tried to argue with the protesters was doused with an inflammable liquid, which was then set alight, and he is now apparently in a critical condition in hospital. This is not a sustainable situation. It is only a question of time, in my opinion, before the authorities in China finally decide that this thing has gone too far and decide to take the inevitable action to bring these protests to a stop. And certain comments that the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, made during the BRICS summit in Brazil suggest that that day is now not far off.
Okay, Alexander, I would say the number one group of tourists here in Spain is without a doubt the Chinese. A lot of tourists here. So that's very noticeable. You mentioned in a message, Alexander, that Hong Kong reminds you in a way to what happened in Ukraine in 2014, end of 2013, 2014. How is what's going on in Hong Kong similar to the Maidan? How is it different? And to close out the video, Alexander, what does the Chinese government need to do in order to bring a peaceful solution to this? And I stress the word peaceful, where both sides are happy with the result. What needs to be done here? Because I think, you know, the Chinese government has really handled this very poorly. That's my opinion. I don't think they've handled this in a good way whatsoever. No, and usually the government in China handles situations pretty swiftly, decisively. I'm not saying violently, but usually they tackle their problems head on. This one, they really let it fester, and they handled it very, very poorly. Very poorly.
I entirely agree with that. I think one of the problems is that the government in China really doesn't understand the situation in Hong Kong very well. And I also think that they grossly overestimated the willingness of the local authorities in Hong Kong to do the sort of things that the Chinese government was expecting them to do. In other words, to act firmly to deal with these protests. Now, where the parallels with Ukraine in 2000...
But firmly, but if I can interrupt real quickly, Alexander, firmly in a negotiation, I want to stress that, firmly negotiate, not violently, we're not saying violently.
Indeed, if we go back to the early period of the protests back in July, if the Hong Kong government, if Carrie Lam, who was then the chief executive, had been prepared to come along, for example, and talk to the people who were at that time protesting. At this time, the protests were peaceful, and most of the people wanted the protests to remain peaceful. She'd come along and that said to them, look, this extradition law, we understand that you oppose it. I'm going to explain to the Chinese government, this simply isn't an option for Hong Kong. Rest assured, I will do everything I possibly can to defend Hong Kong. And having just said those things, but had taken visible steps to meet with the people who were at those times leading the protests, I think this could have been diffused, and I think this could have been diffused fairly quickly. Now, there were some violent people right at the beginning, but police action, I'm talking about normal police action. I'm not talking about sending in tanks or doing all those sort of things. I think normal police action could have handled this. Hong Kong is quite a prosperous place. I think the people of Hong Kong have a good understanding of the limits under which Hong Kong functions and about the nature of its relationship with Beijing. There obviously are a few people who want to go an awful lot further, but I think it would have been possible to isolate this thing much more effectively. That didn't happen. The Chinese government didn't give the Hong Kong government the particular space that it needed. And the Hong Kong government, I think, did, and this is where I think the comparison with Ukraine comes in. I think the Hong Kong government played an overcomplicated and frankly rather dishonest game. On the one hand, as I said, it didn't really feel sorry to see these protests take place because it saw the protests as a way of gaining leverage against Beijing And that was very much something that the Ukrainian government also did in 2013, where it used the protests in Maidan Square to gain leverage, in that instance, in negotiations with Moscow, whilst at the same time not actually working to try systematically to isolate the protesters, those protesters who were really violent, and to address the real issues that existed within Hong Kong society. Now, of course, there is other factor which we can't ignore, and that is that there are big outside players. There's no doubt at all that some of these protesters in Hong Kong have been receiving support from the West, just as the protesters in Ukraine did. But anyway, putting that important issue to one side, I think both the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government have not handled this well. Now, what do they have to do now? I'm sorry to say this, but I think at some level there has to be an attempt to try and regain control of the streets, and that does mean a bigger and more assertive police presence. I think in this kind of situation that is inevitable. That's not a call, by the way, for sending in tanks or for mass roundups or for those sort of things. I think the number of protesters in Hong Kong is now quite small, but I think that is something that has to be done. At the same time, I think there has to be firm guarantees given to people in Hong Kong that the encroachments that they feel from mainland China are going to end, and that means some kind of negotiation between the Hong Kong government and the protesters, and between the Hong Kong government and Beijing. Now, I think the space for this is becoming quite small, and the danger is that eventually Beijing will lose patience with the situation and will take a much stronger line against the protests and will bring them up to heel. Of that I have no doubt. But Hong Kong, as it has existed, will no longer exist anymore.
All right, Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on that subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to make sure you get notifications when we publish a new video. Also, check us out on iTunes and on SoundCloud to get an audio copy of this video as well. And please donate to us on PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribe so we can continue to turn out videos like this one you see here. And also check us out on BitChute and DuranVideo.com, which is our own video platform. And of course, BitChute is the up-and-coming all-star video platform that we're publishing to every day. And Alexander, we are on Telegram and, of course, the Duran shop.
Indeed so, and as you can see, I'm wearing a magnificent Duran long-sleeved t-shirt, which is the absolute right thing on a cold autumn day in London where it's pouring with rain. And also I've got my wonderful Duran magic mug from which I'm drinking royal blend tea to keep me warm. And you can find all these great things on the Duran shop. You can find other magic mugs of various descriptions, but all of them of amazing quality, all 15 ounces, all beautiful porcelain. And you can also find lots of other shirts, not just long sleeve t-shirts, but short sleeve t-shirts, v-neck shirts, and our really fabulous polo shirts. And you can also find hoodies, you can find hats, you can find stickers, you can find great and phenomenal things on our shop. Our competitors are incredibly jealous of the quality of our products. They're trying to copy them. They're making a dismal job of doing it. So get yourself the real good, actual Duran thing from our shop. Help yourself, help the Duran. Alex will tell you how.
Just go to the Duran shop, theduranshop.com. You'll find a link in the description box down below. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Until next time, everybody, take care.